In the 14th century, the world was a place of noise and blood. The Byzantine Empire was fracturing. The Black Death was beginning its slow crawl across the Mediterranean, and the shadow of the Ottoman sword was lengthening across the plains of Thessaly. For the people living in the valley below, there was no horizon that didn't hold the threat of fire. But for a monk named Athanasius, the answer wasn't to run further away. It was to go higher. These pillars are a geological anomaly. They are the debris of an ancient delta, 60 million years of river stones and sand compressed into a fortress. To the invading armies of the 1300s, these rocks were a dead end. They were an obstacle. But to Athanasius, they were a loophole in the geography of war. He realized a fundamental truth that would define this place for the next 600 years. An army can take a city, but no army can conquer the sky. Athanasius didn't have a map. He didn't have a trail. He had a set of iron hooks and a belief that the higher he climbed, the quieter the world would become. Imagine the sheer physical terror of that first ascent. No safety lines, no mechanical advantage, just a friction of skin against weathered stone. Every inch gained was a second stolen from the chaos of the world below. When he finally reached the summit of the rock he named the Great Meteoron, he didn't find a palace. He found a silence so heavy it felt like a presence. He had successfully engineered a divorce from the earth. If you find peace in these hidden corners of the world, consider joining our journey. Subscribe and hit the bell to walk through history with us. We have much more to show you. For the first decade, there were no monasteries. There were only the stylites, the pillar dwellers. They lived in the natural hollows of the rock, pulled up their meager supplies in baskets, and spent their days watching the clouds move through the valley. They were the original architects of isolation. They weren't hiding because they were afraid. They were hiding because they were focused. In the valley, time was measured by the speed of a horse or the swing of a sword. Up here, time was measured by the movement of the sun across the face of the stone. They were perfecting a system of stillness that would eventually require a more permanent structure. Athanasius began to gather followers, men who, like him, were exhausted by the noise of the 14th century. Together, they began the impossible task of building on a summit with no road. Every brick, every bag of lime, and every drop of water had to be hauled up the vertical face. This was the birth of the vertical city. It was a community built on a paradox. To be truly together in spirit, they had to be completely separated from the rest of humanity. This first monastery wasn't just a building. It was a stone anchor, tethering their souls to the sky, while the world below continued to burn. In our next chapter, we will look at the machines they built to maintain this isolation, the wooden winches, and the ropes that held their lives in balance. If the first chapter of Meteora was written in sweat and iron hooks, the second was written in timber and rope. By the late 14th century, the era of the solo hermit was over. The vertical silence was becoming a community. But community needs more than just faith. It needs supplies. It needs stone for walls, wood for heat, and flour for bread. And in Meteora, there was only one way to get those things up a 400-meter wall. This is the story of the Vrizoni, the wooden windlass that turned a cliff into a doorway. The Vrizoni is a masterpiece of pre-industrial engineering. It is essentially a massive horizontal drum, powered not by steam or electricity, but by the physical strength of 4 monks. To look at today, silent and gray with age, it's easy to forget the sheer violence of its operation. When a load was being lifted, the entire tower would shudder. The friction of the hemp against the oak drum created a heat you could smell, a scent of toasted wood and ancient dust. There were no pulleys at the bottom, no safety catches. If the monks at the top lost their grip on the heavy wooden levers, the weight would plummet and the winch would spin backward with enough force to shatter bone. Every basket of stones pulled up to build the monastery of Varlam represented hundreds of hours of manual cranking. They weren't just building a monastery. They were grinding their way into the sky, one rotation at a time. But the Vrizoni didn't just carry stones. It carried people. For over 500 years, if you were a traveler, a bishop, or a new initiate, the only way into the Great Meteoron was the net. Imagine standing on that ledge. You step into a woven hemp bag. You crouch down, pulling your knees to your chest. The monks pull the drawstring tight, and then they push you. Suddenly, the ground is gone. You are suspended in a 300-meter abyss. As the winch begins to turn, the net starts to spin. The valley floor rotates beneath you, a dizzying blur of green and gray. You can hear the rope groaning above you, a sound the monks call the voice of the mountain. There is a famous story told to travelers who visited in the 19th century. A guest once asked the monk operating the winch how often they replaced the rope. The monk looked at him with total sincerity and replied, "Only when it breaks." To a modern ear, that sounds like a joke or a terrifying negligence. But in Meteora, it was a theological statement. Your safety didn't belong to the quality of the hemp. It belonged to the one who allowed the rope to hold. To ride the net was to perform an act of absolute surrender. Everything you see at the top, the 16th century frescoes, the massive oak dining tables, the lead-lined roofs, arrived in that net. The sheer tonnage of material moved by hand is staggering. It is a testament to what a community can achieve when time is not an obstacle. The monks weren't in a hurry. They knew the rock wasn't going anywhere. Today, the Vrizoni systems are mostly silent, replaced by steel cables for supplies and stone stairs for people. But they remain in the towers like sleeping giants. They are reminders of a time when the gap between the earth and the sky was bridged by nothing more than a wooden drum and a terrifying amount of faith. In our next chapter, we will step out of the wind and into the darkness to explore the painted silence, the hidden masterpieces that decorate the interiors of these sky fortresses. Separated the monks from the earth, the threshold of the Catholicon, the main church, separates them from the sun. Outside, the light is aggressive, reflecting off the white-gray conglomerate rock with a blinding intensity. But inside, the air is thick. It smells of 500 years of beeswax, frankincense, and damp stone. Here, the vertical silence finds its voice. This is a story of the painted silence, the hidden masterpieces that turn these stone fortresses into spiritual mirrors. In the 16th century, while the rest of Europe was embracing the bright, human-centric realism of the Renaissance, Meteora was perfecting the Cretan school of iconography. Masters like Frangos Catalanos didn't paint for the public. They painted for the monks who lived in the dark. Look at these walls. Every square inch is covered. There is no empty space, a concept known as horror vacui or the fear of the void. The frescoes act as a visual encyclopedia of faith, but they served a practical purpose too. For a monk standing in a 4-hour vigil at 3 a.m., these images were his companions. In the flickering light of a tallow candle, the figures on the walls appear to move. The saints don't just stand there, they watch. Their eyes are intentionally large and fixed, designed to draw the viewer into a state of nepsis, an ancient Greek term for spiritual wakefulness or sobriety. In the silence of the rock, the paintings were the only conversation that mattered. The technical achievement here is as staggering as the climb itself. These are true frescoes, buon fresco. The artists had to apply mineral pigments to wet lime plaster. They had only a few hours to work before the wall closed and became a permanent part of the rock. There was no room for error, but consider the conditions. They were working on scaffolding hundreds of feet in the air, inside windowless rooms lit only by oil lamps. They weren't using synthetic paints. They were using the earth itself. Lapis lazuli for the blues, cinnabar for the reds, and ochre from the very hills surrounding them. Because the monasteries were so isolated, these paintings remained largely untouched by the wars and reforms that stripped the churches of the lowlands. They are a time capsule of the Byzantine soul. When you look at the Dormition of the Virgin in the monastery of Varlam, you aren't just looking at art. You are looking at the exact same colors that a monk saw in the year 1548. The paint hasn't just survived the rock, it has become the rock. The painted silence isn't a museum, it's a working environment. The monk's day begins when the rest of the world is at its deepest sleep. At 3:30 a.m., the Sumantran, the wooden beam, is struck, calling community to the Catholicon. They stand in these wooden stalls for hours. There is no heating. In the winter, the stone floor is like ice. The only warmth comes from the breath of the brothers and the low glow of the lamps. The chanting is Ison, a deep, drone-like bass that mimics the vibration of the mountain itself. In this environment, the ego disappears. The monk becomes just another layer of the fresco, another part of the vertical history. In our next chapter, we will step back outside and look at the system of survival, the ingenious ways these men captured water and grew food on a summit where nothing should grow. We will explore the giant barrels of Varlum and the secret gardens of the sky. To live in Meteora is to live on an island, but the sea is 400 meters below you. On these summits, there are no springs. There are no wells. The conglomerate rock is porous and dry, offering nothing to those who stand upon it. For the monks, the sky was their only faucet. This is the story of the system of rain, the ingenious hydrological engineering that allowed a community to flourish where nature intended nothing to grow. In the storage cellars of Varlum sits a silent giant, a wooden water barrel built in the 16th century. It is a masterpiece of cooper's craft, capable of holding 12 tons of water. But a barrel is only as good as the system that fills it. Every inch of the monastery's architecture is a funnel. The pitch of the roofs, the placement of the gutters, and the hand-carved stone channels in the courtyards were all designed with a single goal: to catch every drop of Mediterranean rain. In a world where a week without rain could mean the end of the community, water wasn't just a resource. It was a sacred trust. The monks developed a water logic that prioritized conservation above all else. They moved water through gravity, filtering it through charcoal and sand before it reached these massive oak reservoirs, keeping it cool and drinkable even in the brutal heat of a Greek July. With the water secured, the monks faced their second impossible task: food. There is no soil on a sandstone pillar. Every handful of dirt you see in these gardens was hauled up in the same nets that carried the monks themselves. Over centuries, they built a vertical agriculture. By recycling every scrap of organic waste into compost and carefully rationing their stored rainwater, they turned these barren peaks into productive micro-farms. They grew grapes for wine, olive for oil, and herbs for medicine. It was a closed-loop system, a proto-sustainability that predates our modern environmental movement by 500 years. They lived on a diet of the rock, high in fiber, low in fat, and entirely dependent on the rhythm of the seasons. To eat a tomato grown 400 meters in the air is to taste the sheer stubbornness of the human spirit. This constant management of scarcity shaped the monastic soul. When your survival depends on the next cloud, you look at the sky differently. You develop a patience that the modern world, with its endless taps and easy abundance, has largely forgotten. The system of rain wasn't just about plumbing. It was a spiritual exercise in dependency. It kept the monks humble, reminding them daily that their life on the rocks was a gift from above, not a right. Today, modern pipes have brought the valley's water to the summits, and the 12-ton barrels of Varlum are mostly museum pieces. But the stone channels are still there, carved into the courtyards, waiting for the next storm. They remind us that Meteora was never a place of conquest, but a place of careful, quiet cooperation with the elements. In our next chapter, we will look at the king of the rocks, the Great Meteoron itself, to see how these systems of water and faith scaled up to create the largest sky fortress in Greece. Every kingdom has a capital. In the vertical world of Meteora, that capital is the holy monastery of the Transfiguration, better known as the Great Meteoron. It sits on the highest, broadest, and most defiant pillar in the valley, rising 613 meters above the sea. If the other monasteries are outposts of faith, this is the citadel, founded by St. Athanasius himself in the mid-14th century. It served as a blueprint for everything we have seen so far. It wasn't just a place to pray. It was a sovereign territory in the sky, a place where the laws of the valley stopped at the edge of cliff. Building the Great Meteoron was a multi-generational labor of defiance. It took nearly 300 years to reach the scale we see today. Imagine the logistical nightmare of constructing a 14th century cathedral on a mountain with no trail. It required a level of social organization that rivaled the great cities of Europe. Athanasius was joined by a royal disciple, the Serbian Prince Ivan Zaros, who traded his crown for a monk's habit and became Father Joseph, with royal wealth and monastic discipline combined. The Great Meteoron transformed from a cluster of hermit cells into a sophisticated complex. They built an infirmary for the sick, a massive refectory for communal meals, and a library that would eventually house some of the most precious Greek manuscripts in existence. They weren't just surviving on a rock anymore. They were creating a culture. They were proving that the higher you go, the more structured life must become to endure. To understand the Great Meteoron, you have to look at the kitchen. This was the engine room of the monastery. In the center sits a circular hearth where a fire burned almost continuously for centuries. Because what had to be hauled up by net, every calorie of heat was precious. The kitchen was designed with a thermal logic. The heat from the cooking fires rose to warm the living quarters above. This was social engineering at its most basic. The monks ate in the refectory, a grand hall with long stone tables. They ate in total silence, while one brother read from the lives of saints. This silence wasn't a punishment. It was a tool. By removing the distraction of conversation, the act of eating became a shared meditation. They were a closed system, a body of men functioning as a single organism, fueled by the bread baked in these stone ovens and the wine fermented in the cellars below. The Great Meteoron showed that isolation doesn't have to mean fragmentation. In fact, on the rocks, the only way to be alone was to do everything together. From this height, the Valley of Thessaly looks like a distant memory. The Great Meteoron served as a lighthouse for the other monasteries. When its bells rang, they could be heard across the entire complex of pillars. It set the time, the pace, and the spiritual tone for the entire region. But with greatness comes a target. Because it was the largest and wealthiest, the Great Meteoron bore the brunt of the pressures from the outside world. It was a fortress that didn't use walls, but height to keep the world at bay. As we move into the second half of our hour, we will leave these grand halls and descend into the darker, smaller spaces, the Badovas Caves, where most extreme hermits lived in a silence that even the Great Meteoron couldn't match. We are leaving the citadel to find the heart of the hermit. For some, the Great Meteoron was still too loud. In the 14th and 15th centuries, a subset of monks sought a form of isolation that bordered on the absolute. They didn't want walls. They wanted the rock itself. These were the cave dwellers of Badovas. Look at these structures. They aren't buildings so much as wooden shells bolted into the limestone. There is no courtyard here, no garden, no refectory, just a plank of wood between the monk and a 200-meter drop. This was extreme vertical. A life reduced to the dimensions of coffin, suspended in the open throat of the sky. The logistics of the Badovas Caves were a masterpiece of terrifying simplicity. To reach these cells, the hermits used retractable rope ladders. Once they were up, they pulled the ladders after them. They were effectively under a self-imposed siege. They lived on what the monasteries above would lower down to them in baskets: dry bread, a few olives, a flask of water. This was the supply chain of compassion. The hermit provided the prayer, and the monastery provided the calories. But for months at a time, these men would speak to no one. Their only company was a wind whistling through conglomerate stone and the vultures circling the peaks. In the winter, the damp cold of the cave would seep into their bones. In the summer, the rock would radiate heat like a furnace. This wasn't a search for comfort. It was a systematic stripping away of the human ego until only the spirit remained. What happens to the human mind when the horizon is the only thing it sees for 40 years? The hermits of Meteora were practicing a form of sensory deprivation that modern science is only beginning to understand. By removing the clutter of the world, the faces, the voices, the constant choices of the valley, they claimed to see the world with a terrifying clarity. They called this hesychasm, the practice of inner stillness, in the absolute dark of the cave, with only the rhythmic ticking of a prayer rope. The hermit's goal was to reach a state of uncreated light. They weren't looking at the view, they were looking through it. To them, the cave wasn't prison. It was a laboratory of the soul. The rock didn't hem them in. It shielded them from the distractions of a dying empire below. Today, the Badovas Caves are the ghosts of Meteora. Most of the wooden platforms have rotted away, leaving only the iron rings of the rock as evidence of the men who once lived there. They represent the deep logic of this place, that the ultimate fortress isn't made of stone and mortar, but the will to be alone. As we leave the shadows of the caves and climb back toward the light, we move toward the final chapters of our story. We will look at the 1920s breach, the moment when the first stairs were carved into the rock and the vertical divorce was finally settled. The era of the rope was ending, and the era of the world was about to begin. The silence was about to be shared. For over 500 years, the boundary between the earth and the sky in Meteora was absolute. To enter, you had to surrender your life to a hemp rope and a wooden winch. This was a manual filter, a physical barrier that kept the curious, the weak, and the unwanted at bay. But by the 1920s, the internal logic of the monasteries began to shift. The population of monks was dwindling, and the Greek government was looking toward a new era of connectivity. The decision was made to bridge the abyss. They weren't just building a path. They were breaking a 600-year-old seal. The construction was a brutal, manual labor. Because heavy machinery could not be hauled to the peaks, the stairs had to be bitten out of the rock face by hand. Workers spent years suspended on wooden scaffolding, chipping away at the prehistoric conglomerate. This wasn't just civil engineering. It was a psychological transformation. As each step was leveled, the height of Meteora changed. It was no longer a place you had to be admitted to. It was becoming a place you could simply walk to. The monks of the 1920s watched this progress with a mixture of relief and mourning. They knew that the stairs would bring supplies more easily, but they also knew that the stairs would bring the one thing they had spent centuries fleeing: the crowd. The effect was instantaneous. Within a decade of the stairs' completion, the first wave of secular travelers arrived. These weren't pilgrims coming for a week of prayer. They were tourists, a word that didn't exist when Athanasius first climbed these rocks. The breach changed the sensory profile of the monasteries. The sound of the wind was joined by the clatter of leather shoes on stone. The smell of incense began to compete with the dust kicked up by thousands of visitors. The vertical divorce was over. Meteora was being reintegrated into the geography of Greece, becoming a destination rather than a mystery. The stairs functioned as a pressure valve, releasing the ancient isolation and allowing the 20th century to flood upward. We often view the stairs as a convenience, a gift of modern access. But in the history of Meteora, they represent the greatest threat the monks ever faced, greater than the Ottomans, greater than the bandits. When you make a sanctuary easy to reach, you change the nature of the sanctuary. The stairs didn't just move bodies, they moved the world into the sky. Today, as you walk up these steps, you are walking on the remains of a wall that once held back time itself. Every step is a heartbeat closer to the present day. In our next chapter, we will look at how the remaining monks and nuns have adapted to this permanent breach, how they maintain their vows of silence while standing in the middle of a global crossroads. We move from the history of the stairs to the reality of the modern siege. For 600 years, the greatest threat to Meteora was the sword. Today, it is the lens. In the centuries following the 1920s breach, the monasteries underwent a transformation they were never designed for. They evolved from hidden fortresses into global icons. This is the era of the modern siege. It is a conflict not of violence, but of presence. How does a community dedicated to hesychasm, absolute inner stillness, survive when 2 million people a year walk through its front door? The layout of the active monasteries has been forced to adapt. What used to be a seamless space for prayer and work is now a fractured geography. The monks have had to create inner and outer worlds. The public is allowed into the Catholicon and the museums, but the cells, the refectories, and the private chapels remain locked behind thick oak. This is a strategic retreat to maintain their sanity and their vows. The 60 or so remaining monks and nuns have become masters of invisible life. They operate on a schedule that intentionally misses a crowd, rising at 3:30 a.m. to pray in the dark, and retreating to their cells the moment the first tour bus crests the hill at 9 a.m. They are ghosts in their own home, moving to the shadows of the very buildings their ancestors built for total solitude. There is a deep irony in the modern siege. People travel across the world to Meteora specifically because it represents peace and ancient wisdom. Yet, the act of visiting in such numbers is exactly what destroys that peace. Silence has become a commodity. The monks face a difficult choice: to close the gates entirely and lose the revenue needed to maintain these massive stone structures, or to keep them open and risk turning their spiritual life into a performance. Most have chosen a middle path. They act as curators of their own history, using the fund from tickets to restore frescoes and stabilize the crumbling cliffs. They have accepted that their role in the 21st century is to be a living bridge, to show a restless, noisy world that a different way of existing is still possible, even if it's only visible from behind a velvet rope. Despite the crowds, the system of Meteora still holds. The rock remained a shield. Even with the noise of the valley below, the physical elevation creates a psychological distance that is hard to break. The monks know that the tourists will always leave by sunset. The mountain wind will always return to scrub the courtyards clean of the day's echoes. In our final chapters, we will look at the future of this vertical world. We will visit the nunneries, where a new generation is keeping the flame alive. And finally, we will stand on the edge of the abyss to ask, in a world that is running out of quiet places, what happens when the last anchors of the sky finally let go? The siege is constant, but the rock is patient. If you look at the statistics of Meteora from a century ago, the stories seem to be one of slow evaporation. The number of monks was crashing, and many of the smaller outposts were falling into ruin. But in the 1960s and 70s, a new energy arrived on the rocks. Several of the abandoned or struggling sites were converted into convents. Today, while some of the men's monasteries struggle to find new initiates, the nunneries of St. Stephen and Vrizoni are thriving. The vertical silence is no longer a solo male pursuit. It has been reclaimed and revitalized by a feminine discipline that is as rigorous as it is hospitable. There is a different logic of the rock in the nunneries. While the monks built for defense and isolation, the nuns have focused on restoration and education. At St. Stephen's, the most accessible of all the monasteries because of its permanent bridge, the nuns have turned their home into a center for Byzantine art and music. They are the primary reason many of the frescoes we saw in earlier chapters still exist. The revenue generated from their hospitality is funneled directly into high-end restoration projects. They have managed a difficult balancing act. They maintain a strict liturgical life, rising for the same 3:30 a.m. vigils as the monks, but they pair it with an outward-facing mission of philoxenia, the love of the stranger. They have realized that to save the rock, they must invite the world to value it. The nuns of Meteora are often highly educated, coming to the rocks with degrees in theology, history, or restoration science. This has turned the nunneries into intellectual bastions. They aren't just living in history, they are documenting it. In the monastery of Vrizoni, which sits on a lower, sharper needle of rock, the nuns live in a space that feels like a vertical village. Because their monastery is smaller, every inch is utilized. They have mastered the art of the condensed life. Their presence has changed the sensory profile of the cliffs. The heavy, stoic silence of the 14th century has been replaced by a more melodic, communal atmosphere. Their chanting is higher, lighter, yet it carries the same ancient weight of the Byzantine drone. They are proving that tradition is not a museum piece. It is a living, breathing choice made by a new generation of women who find the noise of the modern world louder than the silence of cliffs. As the sun sets, the gender of the inhabitants becomes secondary to their shared purpose. Whether monk or nun, they are all meteori, those suspended in the air. But it is impossible to ignore that the survival of this vertical world now rests largely on feminine shoulders. They have become the buffers between the modern siege and the ancient silence. By creating spaces that are beautiful as well as holy, they have ensured that Meteora remains a place people want to protect, not just a place they want to photograph. In our final chapter, we will stand on the highest peak one last time. We will look into the eternal return and ask what the next 600 years hold for these stone anchors of the sky. The climb is almost over. We began this journey at the base of a 400-meter wall. Looking up through the eyes of a 14th century hermit, we have seen the engineering of the rope, the management of the rain, the painted silence of the interiors, and the modern breach of the stairs. Now, we stand at the final horizon. 600 years have passed since Athanasius first touched this stone. Empires have risen and dissolved in the dust of the valley below. The Romans, the Ottomans, the world wars, they have all come and gone, but the pillars remain. They are the eternal return of Meteora, a reminder that some things are built to outlast the noise of history. Of the 24 monasteries that once crowned these peaks, only 6 remain active today. The others are skeletons, stone shells slowly surrendering back to the mountain. This is a paradox of Meteora. It is a place of immense strength, but extreme fragility. The community of monks and nuns is smaller now than it has been in centuries. The vertical divorce is no longer a physical fact. The roads and the internet have seen to that. The isolation of the future will not be found in the height of the rock, but in the discipline of the heart. The next generation of Guardians faces a challenge the original hermits never imagined: how to remain suspended in the air when the entire world is pulling at your hem. They are the keepers of a flame that is becoming increasingly rare, the flame of absolute, unmediated attention. What is the ultimate lesson of Meteora? It is a monument to the human no. It is a no to the chaos of the valley, a no to the idea that everything must be easy, and a no to the gravity that tries to keep our spirits grounded. In a world that is louder, faster, and more connected than ever before, we need these stone anchors. We need to know that there are places where the sun still rises in silence, where the water is still a gift from the clouds, and where the eyes of saints still watch from the dark. Meteora doesn't ask us to move to a cave. It asks us to find our own vertical silence. It reminds us that there's a profound difference between being lonely and being still. As the lights of Kalabaka begin to twinkle far below, the monks begin their evening prayers. The cycle continues, unchanged by our presence or our cameras. CTA, thank you for watching this deep dive into Meteora. If this video gave you a moment of perspective, please leave a comment below. Tell us which historical site we should document next. Your feedback helps shape the future of this channel.